Great. So hi everyone, my name is Corinna. I'm a board member with the Historical Society of Haddonfield, and on behalf of the society, we welcome you to tonight's presentation, Haddonfield and the Bone Wars, presented by Kathy Tassini. This is our first event in our new virtual lecture series, so we're so excited to have you join us. If you'd like to learn more about future events, please visit our newly designed website at haddonfieldhistory.org. You can also learn here about other upcoming lectures and events, such as our book club and our virtual candlelight dinner. You can also engage in history at home resources, view our collections, take a virtual tour, and much more. And if you're not a member, you can sign up there too. So now to tonight's presentation. Kathy Tassini is Haddonfield's Borough Co-Historian and a longtime board member and volunteer at the Historical Society. She is also the author of numerous articles and co-author of books about Haddonfield, including Lost Haddonfield and Images of America, Haddonfield. Tonight, she will be discussing the intense feud between 19th century paleontologists Edward Drinker Cope and O.C. Marsh. After the Hadrosaurus was found in Haddonfield, Cope and Marsh became heated rivals, each paleontologist battling to undermine the other. So we're really excited to hear this story and Kathy to share it with us. Just couple quick reminders. You may have seen this on the screen when we got started. Kathy will be taking questions at the end. So add those to the chat box there at the bottom of your screen. And then lastly, if you haven't done so already, please double check your mute button, or maybe Sarah has muted everyone, so that's not an issue, but always good to double check that too. So thank you again for joining us. We're so happy to have everyone. And with that, I will hand it over to Kathy.
So the Bone Wars in Haddonfield technically started in 1868, but I'm going to give you a little background about the two principles in the Bone Wars. And the most interesting thing is this is a scientist wage bitter warfare. How did it all come to this? The New York Herald, Sunday, January 12, 1890, screamed the unseemly headline, "Scientists wage bitter warfare. Professor Cope of the University of Pennsylvania brings serious charges against Director Powell and Professor Marsh and the Geological Survey." Is it possible that the spectacular headline and the columns of charges and countercharges which followed for the next week all arose from a supposedly genteel collegial weekend in Haddonfield, New Jersey in 1868? What was the real story behind the Bone Wars, and what was the role, if any, that the small town of Haddonfield played in this great 19th century dispute, which still fascinates people and which affects our perception of two great scientists to this very day? First, let us begin at the beginning with the two protagonists, Othniel Charles Marsh of Yale University and Edward Drinker Cope of the University of Pennsylvania. Othniel Charles Marsh, who much preferred being called O.C., had been born in 1831 in upstate New York, near the Erie Canal, to a farming family. He was a man initially destined for farming until fate and circumstances intervened. His father was an amateur rockhound who took his son hunting for fossils in the scrap heaps created when the Erie Canal was enlarged in 1843. Marsh's father encouraged his son to enroll in a geology class taught by a local soldier, an amateur geologist, Colonel Ezekiel Jewett. Jewett taught young Marsh the basics of finding and collecting specimens. He also brought out the competitive side of Marsh teaching him the fine points of marksmanship and urging him to always be on the lookout for the perfect fossil, to always work on upgrading the quality of his collection of specimens. Working with his father on the farm, Marsh spent most of his spare time hunting for fossils, although still very much an amateur, until at the age of 21, he met his uncle. His uncle turned out to be the wealthy Massachusetts banker and businessman, George Peabody. Peabody was the brother of Marsh's mother, who had died when he was very young. The one pursuit that Peabody was willing to spend his great fortune on was education. O.C. wanted to become educated, and he definitely did not want to be a farmer. Peabody sent him to Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, where Marsh learned to love learning, even though he was significantly older than the other young men in the prestigious prep school. Upon completion of Andover, Marsh asked his uncle to send him to Yale College because of its growing programs in the sciences, especially geology. In September 1856, George Peabody complied and sent his nephew off to New Haven, where he did very well. While a student at Yale, Marsh developed a plan. He decided that he would become a professor of natural sciences at Yale. At the end of his studies, however, the Civil War began, and Marsh tried to enlist in the Union Army. His extremely weak eyes, however, kept him from being accepted into the military. He then asked his Uncle George to send him to study geology and fossils in Europe. His request was again honored, and he went off to Europe to study. While in Europe, he worked on a plan to convince his uncle to donate $150,000 to Yale for a museum of natural history. He succeeded, and the result was to be the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History. Upon his return to Yale in 1866, O.C. Marsh was made professor of the new science of paleontology, all at the age of 35. Marsh immediately began to create the best collection of fossils he could buy or collect for the yet to be built museum building. Edward Drinker Cope was born to a wealthy Philadelphia Quaker family in 1840. His family lived north of the city of Philadelphia on an estate called Fairfield. Like Marsh, his mother died when he was very young. Unlike Marsh, Cope grew up in a privileged environment. At the age of 9, he paid his first visit to the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, where he exhibited a precocious ability with his sketch of an ichthyosaurus, which he saw at the museum. Sorry, I thought somebody was walking around here. After attending Quaker Day School in Philadelphia until the age of 13, Edward was sent to Westtown Friends School, a Quaker boarding school in Chester County, Pennsylvania.
No, it's just a lecture on the Zoom.
This was the traditional route for Quaker children of the day. Cope spent 4 years at Westtown, where he studied a number of sciences and did very well. Edward's father planned on him becoming a farmer after his graduation. He spent most summers working on the family farms and learning the science of farming. Edward, however, preferred the intellectual pursuits. His chance came one winter after he finished at Westtown, when he was working on one of the family farms. He wrote to his father and asked permission to attend a lecture series on anatomy and physiology at the University of Pennsylvania. He explained that knowing anatomy and physiology would help him manage the stock on the farm. His father agreed. Cope's instructor at Penn was Dr. Joseph Lydie, the leading professor of anatomy in America, a member of the Academy of Natural Sciences and a leading expert on fossils in the U.S. Lydie liked Cope and became a mentor to him. He helped him get a job at the Academy of Natural Sciences in 1861, cataloging the Academy's collections of reptile and amphibian specimens. He was sent to other museums on his work, and although he never earned a formal college degree, he became very knowledgeable in the natural sciences because of his contact with the leading scientists of the day. Concern over the Civil War led his father to send him to Europe to continue his education, where he studied the collections of the great museums and met their scientists. While on his European expedition, Cope first met Marsh in Berlin in 1863. He returned to Philadelphia in 1864 with a wealth of knowledge, which he put to use teaching zoology at Haverford College. He also decided that it was time that he should marry, and so he did. Annie Pym in July of 1865. The two were to have one daughter. In 1866, Cope received a letter from the superintendent of the West Jersey Marl Company in Barnesboro, New Jersey, telling him about an interesting fossil they had found in the marl. Marl is a green, sandy clay material which was used in the Victorian era as a fertilizer. In 1858, the first nearly complete dinosaur skeleton ever found, Hadrosaurus folkii, had been discovered in marl on the Hopkins family Birdwood Farm in Haddonfield, New Jersey. Oh, I'm gonna go to, this is Birdwood Farmhouse. Was found, Birdwood Farm in Haddonfield, New Jersey. In 1866, the marl workers often found interesting fragments they knew they could get a little money for from the Academy scientists, hence the note to Cope. This time, however, it was not the usual ocean-going reptile often found in South Jersey marl. It was, according to a letter to his father, a totally new, gigantic carnivorous dinosaurian, which was the devourer and destroyer of Lydie's Hadrosaurus, and of all else it could lay claws on. This was Cope's first dinosaur. He named it Lelaps, the terrible leaper. Cope was on his way in his career, much as Marsh was in his. The first clash, however, was not too far away. Since the first meeting in Berlin in 1863, the two had corresponded occasionally, always cordially. Marsh asked for Cope's input in identifying some specimens of fossils. Cope was flattered by Marsh's request for assistance and admired Marsh for having started a new museum at Yale. The two might have been friends and colleagues for many years, but that was not to be the case. The year 1868 was to be a fateful year in many ways for both Cope and Marsh. In early 1868, Edward Drinker Cope moved his family to the small village of Haddonfield, New Jersey. It was near the marl beds of southern New Jersey, which had yielded the Hadrosaurus and Lelaps specimens. It was also a town with a strong Quaker community and heritage. Cope, now 28, was employed as a curator by the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, the museum with the best collection of dinosaur fossils in America. The family lived in a stately mid-century Victorian house in the middle of town, not far from the Friends meeting and the Friends school, and near the Hopkins farm where Hadrosaurus had been found. It was a perfect situation for Cope and his family. The house, by the way, was at 242 Kings Highway East, Main Street back then, and it was actually torn down to build the Haddonfield Borough Hall. Also in early 1868, O.C. Marsh visited Haddonfield, remaining for a week, perhaps even staying at the home of Edward and Annie Cope on Main Street. Cope took Marsh with him to see and explore the marl beds of South Jersey. He introduced him to workers at several of the marl companies who supplied Cope and the Academy with many of their fossils. Cope had a wonderful time with Marsh. He wrote his father that together they had found several specimens of maritime reptiles. It would be a few months before Cope realized the real outcome of Marsh's visit. In the year 1868 brought a big change for the Academy of Natural Sciences where Cope worked, when the Hadrosaurus fulci became the first dinosaur to be mounted for exhibition to the public anywhere in the world. The fossil was mounted by the British artist Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins with assistance from both Lydie and Cope. It was an immediate and huge hit with the public. Another significant event which took place in the summer of 1868 was Cope's purchase of a fantastic fossil from a man in Kansas. It was a plesiosaur, an ocean-going reptile that lived during the time of the dinosaurs. At 35 feet long, with flippers and needle-like teeth, it was much larger than any other specimen of its type. Cope named it Elasmosaurus platyurus, thin-plated, flat-tailed reptile, mainly because of its long ribbon-like tail. Unfortunately, Cope, working without input from Lydie or others, had made a mistake with the Elasmosaurus, a mistake which was embarrassingly pointed out by O.C. Marsh in late 1868 when he visited the Academy. Cope was anxious to show his friend the specimen, and Dr. Lydie joined them. The specimen was laid out on the floor, and Marsh noticed an error in Cope's reconstruction. The head was attached to the wrong end. If you look at the top drawing in this picture, that was the way that Cope had it mounted, and the correct way was the way it is on the bottom with the extremely long neck. The skull fitted perfectly onto a little ball on the last vertebra of what Cope had thought was an enormous tail. It was actually an extremely long neck. Cope had made a mistake, but he was loath to admit it. He blamed the man who had prepared the bones. He blamed Lydie for something he had written some years ago before that had misled him. He did not, however, blame Marsh. The two of them continued to correspond and consult by letters. So when, where, and why did the bone wars begin? Apparently, one incident which helped to set the war off became apparent in early 1869, when Cope found that the number of fossils coming from the marl beds of South Jersey had all but dried up. Concurrently, Marsh began to publish articles about fossils found in the marl of South Jersey. Marsh had taken advantage of his colleague's hospitality and paid him back by paying off the diggers, to whom Cope had introduced him, to send the specimens to him at Yale rather than to Cope and the Academy of Natural Sciences. There were no more friendly letters between the two formerly congenial colleagues. The dinosaur wars really exploded, however, not in New Jersey, but on the plains of the newly opened American West. In 1869, on a trip across the US, Marsh came across a mound of fossils at Antelope Spring, Nebraska. He returned to the hunt for fossils in the Badlands of Wyoming and Kansas with a group from New Haven in the summer of 1870. The trip was so fruitful that he returned for each of the next 3 years with groups from Yale and sent back hundreds of crates of fossils to the new museum in New Haven. His expeditions not only became the foundation of the Peabody Museum collection, they made Marsh both famous and very influential in government circles. Meanwhile, Cope, back in Philadelphia, was extremely jealous of Marsh's exploits. Marsh was overshadowing the great accomplishments of the Academy and of Cope, and bringing fame and glory to Yale and New Haven. Finally, in the late summer of 1871, Cope headed west to Kansas, the same area which Marsh had explored, and gathered a number of specimens of his own. Had he chosen Kansas as payback for Marsh's incursion into South Jersey marl beds? No one can be sure, but Marsh was certainly annoyed. In 1872, Cope was hired by the government to explore the southwestern part of the Wyoming Territory as part of the U.S. Geologic Survey. This was territory initially studied by Marsh. Again, he was angry that Cope was treading on his territory. Again, there was nothing he could do to stop him. In fact, Cope added insult to injury that summer when he changed the way that finds were announced to the scientific community. In the past, institutions and bone hunters would crate up their finds, send them back to their institutions, and work on them over the winter, writing up their findings in the off-season and sending them to scientific publications. In the summer of 1872, Cope started writing notices about his finds while still in the field. After a day of digging, he would write up his discoveries, telegraph the information, or mail a report from a nearby army fort. Although these reports were far less accurate than the reports issued after careful study in the laboratory over the winter, Cope apparently just wanted to beat Marsh to the punch, since they were both working in the same area and likely to come up with many similar specimens. Marsh, who hated to write hastily all of his life, was infuriated. Now he had to publish quickly, tit for tat, in order to beat out his hated rival. The war in the journals had become ugly. The animosity continued. In 1877, Cope beat Marsh to a great dinosaur site in Montana along the Judith River, from which he extracted a huge number of fossils. A year later, Marsh, acting on information sent by a railroad employees who were looking for a finder's fee, found the great dinosaur beds at Como Bluff near Laramie, Wyoming. Marsh named more than 24 dinosaurs from the site and tried desperately to keep Cope out, even going so far as to destroy specimens when they were leaving a particular area in order to prevent Cope and his men from getting them. Meanwhile, both men were using their fortunes in their efforts to outdo the other. By the late 1870s, Cope had gone through much of the money which had been left to him in 1875 when his father died. Cope was able to continue much of his work in the West only because he was often hired by the US government to serve as its paleontologist on geological surveys. The funding for Cope was about to dry up, thanks again to his old nemesis, Marsh. In 1878, Marsh became president of the National Academy of Sciences. The organization was very influential with the government. Under Marsh, the Academy recommended that the 4 geological surveys, which were being run by the government, should be combined into one. And of course, Marsh was appointed its chief vertebrate paleontologist. Marsh then made sure that Cope never received any federal money for fossil collecting after he took over. Cope spent the 1880s preparing the specimens from his earlier expeditions and writing his mammoth, The Vertebrata of the Tertiary Formation of the West, Volume 1 of a 2-volume proposed set on the Western dinosaurs. The book came in late and way over budget, 6 times the original proposal. The volume became known as Cope's Bible and is still a prized possession by paleontologists today. But when it came time for Volume 2, John Wesley Powell, then the head of the U.S. Geological Survey and a close friend of Marsh, told Cope there was no money for the second volume. Cope, of course, suspected Marsh of being behind the lack of financial support for Volume 2, and he was probably right. He tried for 4 years to get Volume 2 funded, and in 1888 finally gave up, realizing that his old enemy would never allow it to happen. Marsh seemed to have the upper hand. All Cope had left were his own fossils, which he knew he might ultimately have to sell. They were his only remaining financial asset. The final straw in the dispute came in 1889, when Secretary of the Interior John W. Noble wrote to Cope, ordering him to turn over the bulk of his fossil collection to the Smithsonian. He argued that since they had been gathered on government expeditions, they should be in the government's museum. Cope knew it was Marsh who was behind the letter. Cope refused to turn over the fossils. He had spent his own fortune collecting them. In the early days, paleontologists were allowed to keep the fossils as long as they wrote them up. Sorry, I have something on my screen. As long as they wrote them up for government reports, which Cope had clearly done. Marsh had finally pushed the fight too far, and Cope struck back in a way that Marsh probably never imagined in the newspapers. Meeting with a reporter named William H. Ballou of the New York Herald, Cope laid out his case against Marsh, accusing him, among other things, of copying the history of the horse from an earlier report done in Europe, having his assistants write most of his publications, plagiarizing the final chapter of one of his major books from Cope himself, frequently assuming credit for the work of others, and he challenged Marsh's fitness to be president of the National Academy of Sciences. It was a bombshell. Marsh wrote a measured response to the accusation, claiming everything went back to his correction of the Elasmosaurus mounting in 1868. But the battle continued in the newspapers for weeks. In the end, the government backed down and allowed Cope to keep his fossils. The turmoil, however, brought so much negative publicity to the U.S. Geological Survey that the Congress started to look closely at how it spent its money. The congressional investigation led to the elimination of chief vertebrate paleontologist, and in July of 1892, Marsh was told to resign immediately from the now non-existent post. As a result of Cope's charges, it was Marsh who was now required to send those fossils he collected at government expense to the Smithsonian. Cope had ended Marsh's 10-year reign with the government, but at great cost to the science of paleontology. After the publicity died down, the feud between Cope and Marsh quieted down as well, although the two remained bitter enemies for the rest of their lives. Marsh had lost a great deal with his assault on Cope. Losing the government position hurt him both financially and it hurt his ego. He no longer had a nice income from his government work, and his inheritance from his uncle George Peabody was also beginning to run out. Marsh gave his home to Yale University with the proviso that he be allowed to live there until his death. He now concentrated on preparing the huge number of fossils which had been sent to Yale from his expeditions. One thing which Marsh never did was to actually mount any of his dinosaurs for display. He did not believe in that method of displaying specimens, and none of the fossils at the Peabody were mounted until after his death. Marsh died a perennial bachelor 2 years after Cope, on March 18, 1899, at the age of 67. He left most of his possessions to Yale and the Peabody Museum. And following the tirades of the newspaper battle with Marsh, and after finally being given clear ownership of his own fossil collection, Cope's final years were actually pretty happy. He and his family had moved from Haddonfield to Philadelphia in the mid-1870s, where he occupied 2 adjoining townhouses on Pine Street, not far from the Academy and the University of Pennsylvania. One house housed his personal collections, while the other was where he resided with his family. When money problems arose, Cope resolved them by selling most of his collections to the American Museum of Natural History in New York in 1895 for $32,000, quite a good sum for the day. His friend Henry Fairfield Osborne was the head of vertebrate paleontology at the museum, and he knew that his collection would be in good hands. They became the centerpiece of the museum's fossil exhibitions, and still are, by the way. Cope died on April 2nd, 1897, apparently from kidney disease. He was only 57. The bone wars were finally over. In the end, it seems likely that to a great extent, the bone wars were ultimately just the result of 2 huge egos trying to stake out the same turf in the early years of the new science of paleontology. Both wanted to be remembered for their great scientific work, but both were unable to share the spotlight, seeing the other as a threat. In the end, what is most remembered by most people is not the quality of their intellectual work, but the extent of their egos and pettiness. Thank you. And I don't know, let's see if there are, if I can find.
There are some questions.
Are they, I'm looking at the top and I don't.
Oh, where did it go? Hold on. The first one.
Here it is, I see 8. I see them. Okay. Is the fossil farm at Rowan the last of the South Jersey marl pits? Well, it's probably the last of the ones that are operating. There are other abandoned marl pits all over, particularly Gloucester County, I believe. But that's certainly as far as I know, the only one that's operating. How did other paleontologists react to the war? I think most of them just ducked. The people at the Academy in Philadelphia always supported Cope, obviously. However, they got upset because he wanted the Academy to buy his collection. And they were like, well, you've always worked for us. You should just give them to us. You know, they just expected he would give them to them, but he needed money. You know, he was in failing health and he needed to get money for them. And as I understand it, the Academy didn't think that they should have to pay for them. And the museum in New York got them as a result of his friendship with the curator up there. Someone says yes, that the Rowan was the last green sand place in the area. You know, whoever is asking about the is any of his collection at the Academy. I would imagine there are some pieces over there. I should look into that. I would think there are some of his early pieces, at least, especially the ones, probably Elasmosaurus is over there. I don't know if, or did that go to New York too? I don't know. That's a question I never thought of. What surprised you most in conducting your research? Well, just how, it just seems crazy to me how their egos just must have been unbelievable, because it seems like, of course, I was always infuriated by Marsh for bribing the diggers to send the specimens to him. I thought that was pretty underhanded. So that's kind of, obviously I usually take Cope's side as opposed to Marsh's side. But they both in the end became pretty nasty to one another, and they would destroy specimens that were left when they were leaving a site so that the other one couldn't get them, which I thought was very unprofessional of all of them. So none of the collection itself was left to the Academy, although I would imagine that they at least have some of his early specimens when he worked for them. And the question, Marsh's home given to Yale, is it still standing? And I don't, actually, I thought about that the other day, because of course, Cope's house is not standing in Haddonfield. So I don't know the answer to that, whether that's still down there at Yale or not. It's the way the universities are, I would doubt it, but it could be. I'll do some research on that too. Did I get all of them? No, Cope's second book was never printed, unfortunately.
Another message.
As far as those being there are probably letters. There may be some letters between them in 1868 in the archives of either the Academy or of or actually I don't know if Cope's papers are probably in New York. So those are all things I don't know the answer to, but that are great things to continue the search for. I don't know how many specimens Marsh got before Cope realized it, but it was certainly, you know, several months before he realized something odd. First of all, that he wasn't getting them. And then when he saw the publications where Marsh was writing up the South Jersey marl specimens, that's when he knew what had happened. Until then, he had no idea. Let's see. Fossil farm at Rowan. I don't know how the other paleontologists reacted. I mean, I think most people just were trying, you know, people didn't want to get on the bad side of the government because they were paying a lot of the funding. But the Academy of Natural Sciences here was very important. So I would imagine they also didn't want to get on their bad side. So I think it was, I'm not aware of anybody jumping to either man's defense, which is kind of an indication of how most people were just, you know, trying to stay out of it. Cope's early home. I don't, the Fairfield, the farm out in Pennsylvania, is that what the question of Aubrey Arboretum?
Yeah, I'll jump in, Kathy. That was me, because
Oh.
it's down in Germantown, and I thought it was the Edward Drinker Cope House when we visited there for the first time this summer. It's in the mid. It's worth a visit for everybody. It's 55 acres in the heart of Germantown, of fabulous wooded ecosystems, and this great Victorian house.
Hmm.
I
I
thought they
have to
told
look
us
up
was-
and see if that's where Fairfield was. His father had several farms. I mean, he considered Fairfield was the home farm, and but they owned a bunch of farms around Philadelphia area. So, yeah, so a lot of Cope's papers were sold to the Wagner Free Institute. Okay, I did not know that. So someone who wants to, Timothy, somebody can start digging through those and see what we missed. I mean, these guys are all very interesting. The whole, and there are still Hadrosaurus questions. Oh, what were you looking for?
We can unmute him. I don't know who he is.
Okay.
Sorry.
I was looking for where Marsh and Cope found the Swedesboro Cladastes vertebra in April of 1868, trying to pinpoint its provenance.
Oh, I see. And when in those days, would they document the exact locations, or that was something they didn't do it because they didn't want other people to go there, or they didn't do it because they didn't think it was important?
What it seemed to be is that if the landowner was rich enough, that they would mention him. They mentioned the West Jersey marl pits,
Right.
and Voorhees guy, but they never gave a location for the Cladastes one.
Oh, so they didn't get any money for that, huh?
Right. It must have been a miller or a farmer, just with some,
Yeah.
marl pit that they just stopped off in.
Yeah, exactly. Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That makes it more interesting. Okay.
Kathy, I think there's one more question we didn't answer. Is there any fossil exploration where the Hadrosaurus was found?
I've heard people suggest that supposedly, what did somebody tell me that they did do, maybe in the early 20th century, somebody tried to do some digging there, and didn't find anything. I mean, I've often wondered why they didn't go back now with all the technology that they have. It's the county park system now. It's not part of Birdwood, but I've wondered the same thing, actually. I think it would be really cool to, if there's with all the instrumentation that's available these days, I don't think it's been, I think it's a little nebulous about exactly where down there it was found. And maybe that's part of what would hold people up, but I would think that technology could be used to try and find the original spot for Hadrosaurus, because I just think it would be really interesting. There were crustaceans found on what's now the specimens found just off of Hopkins Lane, where the man house was at the same time as Hadrosaurus was found, because they did a little digging around there also, thinking that whole area could have more specimens. So
I know that the hadrosaur was originally found in the 1830s. A few vertebrae had been found then, and then 20 years later, Folke, in his visits at the farm, found, realized what had happened and went back and found the more of the skeleton, and they actually overdug the area to make sure they had gotten it all out of there. So there was belief that they had gotten it all out. However, in the proceedings of the Academy of Natural Sciences, the scientific journal article that describes the fossils that Folke found, there is an incredible and detailed map of the exact location along that little rivulet there where the fossils were found.
Yeah, I've read that piece, and I knew there was a map in there about where they finally found it, because they took several digs. They dug. They actually didn't find it until they brought back one of the original marl diggers, who had worked back then, who worked there then, and he then was able to show them in the area where it had been found. And then of course there were pieces that apparently had been given away by Hopkins 30 years before when it was first found. And I don't know that they got back very many of those, if any.
Right, no, those were all lost, he said.
Yeah. I don't know what the story is going to be with Bancroft. It seems to me that based on the scientific reports from the Hadrosaurus folki, that somebody should be requiring a dig, at least in the area where the crustaceans were found near Hopkins Lane. But because that's pretty well documented. I mean, that's also shown on the map where those specimens were found in the report of the Academy. So, I mean, under New Jersey law, you're supposed to do an archaeological dig if it's an area that could have important materials.
Is that it? Any other questions? Did we get them all?
I think that was the one about the
last one.
Bancroft one was the last one. Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah, I really like. I mean, I really got into this. The society wrote. Well, the society had published a book in 1992 called "The Haddonfield Home of Edward Drinker Cope," which we have for sale. I think it's $1. And it was a young guy named Tom Holmes who came in one day to the society asking about the Cope house, and I knew where it was, and I knew that it had been Merritt Farrow's house. That was the Farrows who sold it to the borough. And so I put them together, and they came up with a wonderful little history of more a history of the house than Edward Drinker Cope. But it was really neat. And the building behind Borough Hall was originally the servants' quarters, the building that's still there behind Borough Hall and that used to be Interfaith is the servants' quarters for the house. Apparently the property had a windmill and a huge barn, and it was really magnificent. So it's all gone except for the little servants' quarters. Great. Thank you. And when is our next speaker for this series?
February 10th, Shamel Jordan will be speaking on history and Lawnside.
Yeah.
We'll be sending out through the Eventbrite list. I'll be sending out more information about that. And that is also free. And hopefully everybody will be interested in hearing about that as well.
Yeah, I think the Lawnside Haddonfield connection is really very interesting as well.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Kathy. That was
Kathy. It was great.
Quite all right.
awesome. All right, guys.
You're welcome.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Kathy.
Yes. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.